Today I'm going to be talking about our most recent findings from this project called GAP2. So Gender, Agriculture and Assets project, in its second phase we're developing metrics for measuring women's empowerment in agricultural development programs. I'm here representing a very big team. My co-PIs, Agnes Kisumbing, Ruth Meinzendick, and our founding PI, Nancy Johnson, as well as our entire team of GAP2 projects across the different partner institutions. So why do we need a measure of empowerment in agricultural development? Well, if we're trying to look at different types of projects, these could look very different. So you could have a project that's looking at, let me try the, oh, there you go. You can have projects that look at, that are trying to teach women how to prepare nutritious foods for their kids. You can have a project that's teaching informal milk traders about safe food practices. You could have a program that's organizing women into self-help groups, or you can also have a project that's trying to engage men in nutrition and helping them learn more about nutritious foods and how to support their families and their children in that effort. So all of these projects have an aim of measuring empowerment, but how do you track progress? It's going to be very difficult unless we have common metrics. And that's really sort of the main reason we started looking into this. And so if we want our projects to provide opportunities to empower women, how should we do that? We needed an indicator or some metrics that incorporated women's voice, but also can be compared across different settings. So this is the big project team. So what we're doing is using a portfolio approach for measuring empowerment. What do we mean by a portfolio approach? So basically, this is a collaborative effort. So we're working with 13 development projects that have signed up for this effort. And what we're trying to do together is to learn what works best to empower women. And so this is an initiative that's funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, USAID, and the Agriculture for Nutrition and Health Research Program at the CGIAR. And so the idea is to look at what's working best to empower women, but we're also interested in what doesn't work. So we're not only looking at looking for positive impacts, we're also looking at how to make strategies better. So if some strategies are not effective or are only effective in certain contexts, we need to know that so that we can make our investments more effective. And in particular, we're also interested in gender-blind approaches, because sometimes when we think about agricultural development projects, they say, oh, gender is not really a main concern, but is that truly a benign sort of way to do things, or are we actually leading into some unintended consequences? So having a metric around women's empowerment can help us unpack that and see whether that's actually happening. And of course, we were very interested in comparability across a portfolio. So for large organizations like the Gates Foundation, like USAID, that are working in many countries, many contexts, they need to have a way to look at their investments across these different projects. So just briefly on which projects we're working with. So here's sort of a snapshot of our portfolio. So we have 13 projects in all. They vary across sort of intervention area and by objective. So some of them focus specifically on nutrition. Some of them have both an income and nutrition objective. And then they're spread out across different countries, I think 9 countries in total, in the Gates focus countries. And some of them do both crops and livestock as well. In terms of design, all of them have rigorous design. So 7 of them are doing randomized controlled trials, 4 are doing matching methods. We have 1 that's doing difference in difference, and 1 doing random encouragement design. And of course, all of them are also doing complementary qualitative work as part of this pilot. So when they sign up, the deal is they sort of work with us to figure out what domains and aspects of empowerment should be in a project level indicator of women's empowerment or metric of women's empowerment. And then they also pilot and test the instruments in their projects directly, and then we have continuous feedback with them throughout the validation and index construction sort of phase. And so these are really our partners in developing these metrics. Now, once we started looking at the 13 projects and how are they exactly trying to empower women, and so part of the thing we realized was that actually our projects are using very different approaches. And in fact, we could classify them according to sort of different types of objectives, different types of strategies, which of course requires also different types of metrics, because if you're using a different strategy, a different activity, you need different ways to track progress. And so really, this led us to this framework, which we're calling Reach, Benefit, and Empower framework. So this is a way to sort of organize agricultural development programs according to what their goal is. So some projects aim to reach women, and that just means including women in their program activities. A lot of agricultural development projects start out this way. Of course, you also have projects that would like to deliver some benefits to women as well. That could be nutrition, that could be income, food security, basically increasing women's well-being in some form. But then you also have projects that aim to empower, which is really what all the projects in our portfolio are trying to do. And here it goes beyond just reaching them, goes beyond giving them benefits. You also would like to make sure that they have stronger abilities to make strategic life choices in areas they care about and to put those choices into action. So this bit is actually quite a step beyond. And I think what people don't realize is that just delivering benefits does not necessarily lead to empowerment if there is no sort of clear way to strengthen agency for women. And like I said, alignment here is really important. Strategies and activities to achieve these aims will be quite different, and therefore indicators will also be very different. So let me give you a concrete example. And since this is a nutrition crowd, I'm going to go with a maternal nutrition program example. So now here, I wish, there's a lot of text. I wish my animation was working, but so let's focus on the first column here. So imagine a maternal nutrition program, and let's think about what kind of objectives would it have around reach, benefit, and empower. So first, reach. Usually by design, because it's a nutrition program, it's already targeted to women, so the reach is already pretty much built in. So they're trying to deliver, say, a nutrition intervention to women. You may want to think about what type of women you want to reach and how you want to do that. So some of the strategies that a program might do is to make sure there's childcare support, because these are usually young mothers. You want to be able to conduct a training if you're doing training during convenient times of the day. You want to try to make sure that they are able to come to trainings, or that the intervention actually makes that easy for them. And then if those are your strategies, what indicators can you then measure? Well, you would measure how many women are attending nutrition training, how many women are receiving the intervention, and which types of women are receiving the intervention. So this is pretty sort of straightforward, and maybe most commonly used indicator we see in agricultural development are just counting numbers of women, right? But if you're doing that, really you're just trying to reach. Now, thinking about benefits in a nutrition program, a program like this would also want to increase women's nutritional status. How would you make sure you do that? Well, the design of the program needs to consider women's preferences and constraints and needs in the design, the content of the training, the delivery of the training or intervention. To track that, you need sort of individual level data around the nutrition outcome that you're tracking or interested in, as well as time use. Since this is a maternal nutrition program, time use would of course be very important. So those could be some of the indicators that you're looking at. If we were trying to empower, so again, like a step beyond, and this is kind of where I'll head to for much of the talk, then what we're really interested in is not just increasing women's nutritional status. We're really trying to increase women's agency over their health and nutrition decisions. And so you're going to want to think about how do you enhance women's decision-making power within their households and communities, especially on those health and nutrition decisions. So this would require, so if this is your goal, then this would require some metrics around decision-making power over income, over food consumption, especially nutritious foods, health. You may want to think about tracking attitudes towards gender-based violence, tracking time burden, so things like that. So again, depending on your goal, some strategies would make sense and indicators kind of follow. So you need alignment across all three. Often we see sort of a mismatch, right? We have programs that say we're aiming to empower women, so we're here, but actually they're doing this. And it's not really clear whether, say, the content of the training is really thought of by the women themselves as beneficial. It could be, for all we know, a waste of time because it could be a crop they don't care about, a topic they don't care about, and they're just there because their husbands couldn't go. And then you're tracking this indicator and then claiming empowerment. So there's this whole kind of stretch of steps that need to happen to get to empowerment. And unless you're tracking that, you're not really able to tell that story. Okay. So in GAP 2, broadly speaking, our projects are sort of using very different strategies. And projects use a combination of these, right? So these are just kind of the broad buckets where we're able to kind of categorize what the different projects are doing. So many of them are trying to do providing goods and services directly or indirectly. There's trying to strengthen organizations, either they're forming groups or strengthening existing groups or strengthening connections between them. Building knowledge and skills, so agricultural training and extension, nutrition training, business training, and then influencing gender norms, so community conversations to identify solutions to gender issues, awareness raising about gender issues and their implications. And so the strategies that are in blue, these are the most common ones. So about 8 or more out of the 13 projects are actually using them in their program. And then the others that are in bold are sort of the next most common ones. So providing goods and services are there, business and finance training. And then the others are sort of not as common in our specific portfolio. Okay, so the implication of all of this is that for projects, again, alignment is important. If you're trying to think about impact, you want to make sure what is your goal, how are you going to do it, so that's where the strategies come in. And then if you're seeking to empower, if you want to be in that last category, you want to think about which tactics will affect which domains of empowerment. For funders, what this means is that they also need to look for alignment. If they're looking for impact, then they want to make sure all their grantees have a theory of change that makes sense and that they're tracking the right things, that their activities are aligned. And I want to emphasize this empowerment bandwagon. We see it all the time. People have a lot of enthusiasm for working on empowerment, but sometimes there's no motor to drive that change. And so this is just sort of a way to screen sort of proposals and projects to make sure that if we're aiming to empower, that we make sure that our strategies, our tactics, our activities are designed to achieve that. And then for both, of course, what this means is that we need a suite of indicators that can then measure empowerment at the project and at the portfolio level. So, Project WEAI, this is a pretty long introduction to why we're doing what we're doing, but basically, so in GAP 2, what we're trying to do is to develop a project-level Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index, or PRO-WEAI as we're calling it, and we're trying to get at comparable metrics for empowerment with sort of two broad components. So first, we're trying to develop a core set of PRO-WEAI empowerment modules, so these would be the must-have, like these are things you need to measure. If you're aiming to empower women, these are sort of the required instruments. So we have a quantitative survey as well as qualitative protocols under the core. And then we're also developing standardized add-ons depending on project needs. So if you remember that cluster of projects I talked about, there's a big cluster working on nutrition, there's a big cluster working on livestock, and there are specific sort of types of decisions, there are specific types of other aspects of that we need to track to be able to tell if the strategies are working. And so we're developing for that a nutrition and health add-on module for the nutrition projects, and also a livestock enhanced module for the livestock project. So the nutrition and health, I'll talk a bit about towards the end. Livestock enhanced is in progress, and that will be coming up next. Okay. So where do we begin? So if you want like comparable metrics at the project level, where do we start? So this is where we start. So the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index, for those of you who have not yet heard of it until today, this is a tool that was launched in 2012, so it's about 6 years old, first grade. So I'm a kindergartner, so all my analogies are about school. So it was developed by USAID, IFPRI, and the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative. It was originally designed as a monitoring and an evaluation tool for Feed the Future. So the goal was to measure inclusion of women in the agricultural sector. This is a survey-based index, which means it's embedded in a population-based survey. So it's not something you field as a standalone thing. It's something that's embedded in a population-based survey. It interviews men and women in the same household, which is a really unique feature of this index. And then there's an Alkire and Foster in Rural Development with all the methodology. If you're interested, I can send you the link later. I'm not going to go through all the methodology today, but this is sort of where we began. So this tool is already measuring women's empowerment, but at the population level. So where was it collected? So in the pilots, we looked at 3 countries. So we looked at it in Bangladesh, Guatemala, Uganda. And then after it was launched, Feed the Future rolled it out to their 19 focus countries. So yeah, and here's the list. And so they started collecting sort of baseline information around the WEAI, together with all the other sort of population-based indicators that they collect in their program. Now, what happened after that was really quite exciting. This happened. So we knew that there was a huge gap for a metric for women's empowerment, but we were actually quite surprised at how quickly other organizations and projects started using and adapting the tool. So they kind of saw the tool, even though, it was, of course, developed for Feed the Future and their program, but they would find domains that made sense for them, so they would use what they could use and modified some others. So we're calling these off-label WEAI adaptations. It wasn't originally designed for those programs, but that's how people started using them. And this really communicated like a real demand for a metric around women's empowerment. But it also raised some issues. So one problem with all of these adaptations is that it became very difficult to compare and synthesize lessons across the different users. And we're still struggling with this today. So on the one hand, it's great that there's a lot of thinking around how we measure women's empowerment, but at the same time, we have sort of different cases, say, 3 different projects trying to get at the right way to include attitudes towards domestic violence, and they could all be doing it a little differently. We don't really know which one is the most effective way because they're sort of doing it in very different designs. And so that led us to Pro-WEAI. So that's one of the reasons why we thought we needed sort of a coordinated attempt to develop the metric with actual different types of agricultural development projects working with us on that. So in the original WEAI, it was collecting 5 domains of empowerment in agriculture. So we have production, resources, income, leadership, and time. And those 5 domains are measured by a set of 10 indicators that are all equally weighted within the domain. So the 5 domains are equally weighted, and then within each domain, those are all equally weighted. The indicators are equally weighted. So what the WEAI had to offer was women's and men's empowerment scores that are assessed across those 5 domains in agriculture. It's a standardized measure that's internationally validated and allowed us to diagnose empowerment gaps. So basically, this is not just because we have both men's and women's scores, so within the same household we can look at empowerment gaps that way, but also we're able to disaggregate the index. So you have one number that summarizes women's empowerment for a given population or program, that is the overall WEAI for that population, but you also have the very rich survey data underneath that you can use to disaggregate and unpack the sources of that disempowerment. So it does both things. And so this diagnostic feature of the WEAI was actually really, really helpful because it can help us figure out how we should prioritize our investments. So when we look at, it could tell us where the empowerment gaps are, and therefore how we should design the program to be able to close those gaps. So in all of these, in the off-label uses of the WEAI, what they were really communicating was, expressing was a demand for a tool that could do other things that the WEAI couldn't, right? Because they were sort of changing it here and there because they wanted to adapt it to their context. So what they really wanted was a tool that they could use at the project level that could adapt to their project context, that looked at domains related to health and nutrition, sort of other domains beyond the WEAI. I'll talk a bit more about this later. Other domains like intra-household harmony, mobility, control of income from the project interventions, and then attitudes towards domestic violence. Everybody wanted a shorter, more nimble tool, of course, because one of the issues that projects always run up to is resource constraints. So these are the demands, right? And so how does ProWEAI fill that gap? And so before I get into sort of the nuts and bolts of where we landed in ProWEAI so far, let me go back to just what are we trying to measure when we're trying to look at, when we're trying to measure empowerment. So in the WEAI, we use the Kabir definition of empowerment. There are, of course, many, many ways to define empowerment. It's a very complicated concept, but in WEAI we use the Kabir definition. And she conceptualizes empowerment as a process of change composed of 3 interrelated dimensions. So you have resources, agency, and achievements. So resources are those material, human, social resources that enhances a person's ability to exercise choice. Agency is the ability to define one's goals and act on them. And then achievements represents the actual achievements of one's goals. Right? So all of these things comprise empowerment. Now, what's very interesting is that in our qualitative work, we're really hearing these dimensions echoed in the field. So how local communities understand empowerment very much sort of line up with this framework, which I thought was really, really interesting. So one of the things I wanted to point out here was this insight that was coming out about how an empowered person, both a man or a woman, both men and women had this view, was not just about the person, it was about their community. It goes beyond them, somebody who could take care of others. And so it's not just about the women, it goes beyond her. So we thought that was really, really interesting insight coming out of the qualitative piece. So in the WEAI, we don't measure everything about empowerment. So I think that's really important to point out. We're really focusing on agency. Now, why do we do that? Because, especially during a time when the WEAI was developed, we already had indicators, methodologies, approaches that measured resources around, physical capital, human capital, social capital. We also had methodologies to measure achievements, outcomes we care about, like nutritional status, yields, profitability, incomes, that sort of thing. And so we know how to measure resources and achievements better than we knew how to measure agency. And so there was really a deliberate effort to focus on agency for the WEAI. And so the idea is not to use the WEAI as the only empowerment measure, but to use that in conjunction with other measures that we're already collecting that also bring up these other aspects of empowerment. Okay, so in the WEAI, in all versions of the WEAI, it really measures 3 types of agency. So we have power within, and power within is just that internal sense of agency, intrinsic agency. It reflects internal voice, self-respect, or self-confidence. And then the second type of power the second type of agency is power tool or instrumental agency. So this is the power we get from, this is the person's ability to make decisions in their own best interest. And then the last type of power is collective agency, power with. And so this is the power we get by working with others. So a woman working with other women has a different type of power than a woman just working on her own. There is a fourth type of power in the empowerment literature that's not reflected in the WEAI, and that's power over. So power over is often associated with negative expressions of power like dominating others and coercion. And in our qualitative work, what we actually found was that communities had a negative view of this type of power, and it didn't enter into people's own understandings of empowerment. And for those reasons, we exclude power over in pro-WEAI. So in pro-WEAI, what we've done is to make the links to the empowerment literature a bit more explicit. So these three types of agency are now our three domains. So we have intrinsic agency, instrumental agency, and collective agency. So recall that in the original WEAI, we had 10 indicators of empowerment across 5 equally weighted domains. So in pro-WEAI, we have 12 indicators of empowerment across 3 domains. Okay, and so unfortunately, these very light ones are not very readable, so sorry about that. So those are the main differences. Now, of course, the pro-WEAI builds on the original WEAI. So there are 7 indicators there that are very much sort of building on some of the original indicators with some changes. So for example, this indicator, you can't really see it, I'm sorry about that, autonomy and income. In the original WEAI, this was around autonomy and production, so we had shifted the focus to be broader around income. Some of these decision-making around production decisions and asset decisions and asset ownership, we sort of adjusted cutoffs to be stricter, so you need more input into those decisions to be considered adequate in those indicators. And then work balance, we've just renamed. It used to be called the workload indicator, but we thought work balance actually reflected the market and non-market work more accurately. So those were the indicators building off of the original WEAI. So these would, if you've used WEAI before, these would all be pretty familiar with you. Now the new indicators are where all the action is, and these are really the topics that the projects raised, or these are based on what the project said they wanted to measure. So under intrinsic agency, we have self-efficacy, attitudes about domestic violence, and respect among household members. So just on the top side. And then attitudes about domestic violence in particular, I think is really important, especially in the context of projects that have a risk of doing harm in the form of increased violence against women. So this is a way for us to quantify backlash by tracking whether there's increased tolerance of domestic violence. And then instrumental agency, we have mobility or visiting important locations such as markets or NGO training centers, and in collective agency, we have membership in influential groups, which just augments the original group membership indicator. And so the last piece, before I turn to the nutrition part, the last piece of the puzzle is the overall empowerment cutoff. So how many indicators does a woman need to achieve to be considered empowerment based on this measure? And so what we've done in the original WEAI, the cutoff was actually 80%. So a person was considered empowered if they were adequate in 80% or more of the weighted indicators. And in the pro-WEAI, it's a similar but slightly lower cutoff. So a person is considered empowered if they are adequate in 75% or more of the indicators, or 9 out of the 12 indicators. So here are just some results on pro-WEAI. So this chart just summarizes the extent of disempowerment among women and among men, which is just the length of those bars. So the gap between the 2 bars shows us the empowerment gap between men and women. So not surprisingly, women are more disempowered. But then the colors within tell us the relative importance of each of the indicators in that disempowerment. So what's interesting here is that even though we have this gap, the top two contributors to disempowerment for women and men are similar. They're both around collective agency, which we think are really important. But then you have important differences in some of the runners-up. So this is visiting important locations, and here you have respect among household members. And these are large contributors to disempowerment for women, but not for men. And so those are indicators that are new. And so if you use the original WEAI, those would be aspects that would have been missed, but that's being captured here in pro-WEAI. So let me just move quickly on some of the latest, what we're doing on the health and nutrition module, which, as I talked about, was an add-on module. So the pro-WEAI health and nutrition module, it's an optional module that and suite of indicators that projects can use alongside the core pro-WEAI for their impact evaluations. And so you may be wondering, if we're already collecting core pro-WEAI, why do we need another module on health and nutrition? Well, many of our agricultural projects have nutrition-sensitive goals. So they may want to increase nutritional status or an immediate determinant of that, like dietary diversity. And often, they're aiming to achieve this by increasing production and then later the consumption of nutrient-rich foods, and by increasing women's income so that they're able to purchase key food and health inputs. But there are a lot of intervening steps between production and consumption. So, for example, women who have control over whether a cow or whether its milk is sold might not be able to have to be able to allocate certain foods for herself or for her children. So even when she has control over milk production or about that asset, it doesn't always translate to agency over certain nutrition decisions. So in pro-WEAI, we focus on agriculture and production sort of domains. And in the health and nutrition module, we focus on instrumental agency around the direct determinants of a woman's own health and that of her children. So it looks at agency, but specific to the nutrition and health domains. So to apply this nutrition sensitive lens in the development of this module and set of indicators, it sort of uses three guiding principles. So the first one is that it needed to reflect the food, health, and care paradigm that our nutrition sensitive projects are using as their guiding theory. The second is that it needed to be life cycle sensitive. So as we know, there are unique nutrition and health needs for women during pregnancy and lactation, and then for children during infancy and early childhood. And so this was really important to think through, when we're looking at this type of module. Also, these are the times in women's lives when they are least able to exercise agency oftentimes, so it's important to look at it specifically. And then third, we also wanted to emphasize animal-sourced foods because a lot of our projects focused on livestock production and aim to increase consumption of animal-sourced foods. So all of those sort of factored into what we were trying to do in the health and nutrition indicators. So where did we land? So this is the draft version, right? So we have what we came up with are these 7 indicators. So the first 2 that are shown in purple here are specific to women's own health. So these are decisions about their own health and diet and decisions around their own health and diet during pregnancy. And so let's go a bit more in depth here. So for the first one, a woman who achieves empowerment in terms of decisions around her own health and diet is either the sole decision maker or has significant input into decisions related to whether she can rest when she's ill, what foods to prepare, and what food she eats. And then, so the 2 indicators shown in yellow are decisions about their child's diet and decisions about weaning and breastfeeding. Here in the red, we have decisions about seeking health care, so both for herself and for her child, related to both illness and preventative care. And then the last 2 indicators are around, here in green, are around whether she can make decisions to purchase food and health products, and whether she can acquire these products by some means. So often it's not just purchasing, but also cultivating it or acquiring it in some way, some other way. So to give you an example of how this can be used, so this is a graph that just shows us the percentage of women who achieved empowerment according to each of the indicators I just outlined. So just for illustrative purposes, this is simply an average pooled across all the data sets. So we have data from 6 projects that had piloted this module, 3 in Bangladesh, 2 in Burkina Faso, and 1 in Mali. You can see, for example, here about 51% of women are able to make decisions about their own health and diet during pregnancy, so this one, right? While about 34% of women are able to make decisions related to the child's diet. And so what this is telling us is there's room for projects to impact these indicators. So that's all we have so far. So all of this is, of course, work in progress. So right now we've collected information on baseline data, actually, for all the projects, and end lines are ongoing. So we're waiting to see for end lines to be able to answer questions around how sensitive these indicators are over time, so stay tuned for that. But in the meantime, I invite you all to visit our online resource center. It's weia.ifpri.info. And there's a sign up there for our community of practice. So if you'd like to be alerted to updates, please sign up. We also have some blog articles there, a lot of resources, do files, data sets, protocols, on previous WEAIs, as well as some information on Pro-WEAI. The actual instruments on Pro-WEAI are not up there yet because it's still in progress. But if you're interested, reach out to us and we can talk. But yeah, so that's all I have so far, and thank you so much for your attention.
So I'm wondering about the decision on the 75% adequacy. You said that was different than the 80%. How did you get that number? Are you validating? Like, what can you possibly validate?
Right. So the reason we need a cutoff for overall empowerment, first of all, is so that we can tell, we can group women into empowered and disempowered. Like how many adequacy, how many areas do you need to be adequate in to be empowered? And that's really critical in some of the features, the diagnostic feature of the WEAI, and so that's the reason why it's there, number one. Now the actual number, that's a good question. So in the original WEAI, because they had 5 domains, 80% meant achieving 4 out of the 5 domains. The tricky thing about the cutoff is that if you keep it, if it's so high, it means there's not very much room for improvement. And if it's too low, it means it's very hard to reach empowerment, right? So there's a lot of sensitivity analysis also that we're doing around the cutoff to see, whether it changes very much the types of women that are classified or, one way or another. So that's part of the sort of validation we're doing. But why 75? It's really a judgment call. So on the one hand, you want it to be sort of from a practical point of view, you want it to be low enough that you can show progress towards it, but also not very low that it doesn't make sense. So it's really a more practical decision at this point. But also 75, because we have the 12 indicators, it's easy to remember, it's easy to communicate, it kind of has that saliency, so that's also an advantage. Sorry, I don't have a. Yeah, it looked like Devin had a follow-up.
Just to follow up on that, I was just wondering if there was any discussion about doing non-binary like cutoff, so maybe marginally empowered, like really lowly empowered, or high empowerment.
So that's interesting. So we haven't looked into that, and I don't know actually what that would do to the decomposability feature, but that doesn't preclude anybody from doing that, because actually what you end up with in the WEAI in your data set is that you get an empowerment score for everyone before you do the censoring step, which is where you group people into empowered and disempowered. So before that step, you get everybody's empowerment score, and you can easily classify that into quintiles or tertiles, is that a word? Into groups, high, medium, low, and that's something anybody could look at. I don't recall looking at it ourselves. When we've looked at empowerment scores, we've usually used it, the full scale. So if you were going full scale, go full scale and then binary. So that's how we've used it so far, but you're welcome to try it and let me know what happens. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Malapit. This is really a great presentation.
I just was wondering about the application of the health and nutrition module to women in general, in the sense irrespective of whether they participate in agriculture or not.
Say that last bit again. Regardless of.
Regardless of their participation in agriculture.
Aha.
So can
Yes.
we
Okay.
apply the health and nutrition module?
Right. Okay, that is a great question. So, and I should have mentioned that one of the main differences between WEAI and pro-WEAI is the sampling, because WEAI is a population-based index, so it's in a population-based survey. Project WEAI is for the project, and so the respondents are chosen, it's the beneficiary, it's whoever it is the project wants to track. Like, whose empowerment are you trying to track? So this is for the projects themselves to answer. Whose empowerment does it make sense to track? So to answer your question, if it was a nutrition project, usually it would be the index mom or the mother, the caregiver, or the mother of the young child, regardless of whether they're working in agriculture or not. So it depends on the project. In our case, because these are all agricultural development projects, I would be surprised if they're not engaged in agriculture. I think all of them are to some extent. But even if they're not, a lot of our indicators capture both farm and non-farm. So if they're doing some sort of livelihood, I think it would be in the way. It would be captured. Does that answer?
Only if they're doing some form of livelihood, what if they are, stay-at-home moms?
That are not engaged in agriculture? Yeah. So what happens in the WEAI is that if for example, they say, oh, this is the production module doesn't apply to me because I'm not doing any of the activities, then they do drop out. That's because if you're missing one indicator, you're not able to calculate a full score. So that is one consequence of that. So yeah, that's something to think through. If you're working in a project that's not, well, first of all, it's called Women's Empowerment in Agriculture, so I guess that explains the agriculture focus. But even in our populations, some of them are not necessarily working all in agriculture, as you said. So I think some of them, if that's the case, then they do drop out. But if there's too many of them, I think it definitely requires attention on is this actually the right sample that you're measuring. Yeah, Hallie.
I was just wondering, some of these projects you said are focusing on norms and agency. Do they use results of the WEAI to kind of see discussions in the communities and start saying, do you see any of that in projects that are focused on that?
Okay. That's actually a really good idea. Now, the thing is, I'm not sure. I think, so the ones that I'm most familiar with, I know, so for example, the Angel Project in Bangladesh, it uses the HKI curriculum and community, that does these community conversations. And I think there are certain kind of key messages in that curriculum. So it's not so much, not the WEAI results, but that's a really interesting idea, and it could be a way to do midterm corrections using WEAI. So that's a really good suggestion. So let me park that and try to get back at Oh, am I supposed to? Do I just? No, I don't want to mess it up and drop people off. It disappeared. If you hover, yeah. Oh, if I hover? Nope. They changed their mind. Oh, there it is. Chat. Why do pro-WEAI focuses on attitudes towards domestic violence when others have linked the actual experience of domestic violence using DHS data rather than attitudes towards some of these health and nutrition outcomes? Okay, that's a great question. And the practical reason is that it's really difficult to compel projects to collect actual incidents of domestic violence for ethical reasons. It's a really kind of high bar for the IRB. And also, like, in terms of capacity of these teams, it's quite difficult, whereas attitudes towards domestic violence, I understand, is because it's attitudes, it's not actual experience. I think the standards are a little different and a little more accessible to our project teams. So we've kind of landed there instead. So that's a great point, but we actually did think about how it wouldn't be very practical to collect actual experiences.
Just to clarify, you're saying that if you ask people if they're actually abused and they say yes, then there should be follow-up.
Right. Well, yeah. There's some duties that come with that. like reporting and all that, and risk of harm, obviously. So yeah, so it's messy, so, and that's the reason. So I hope that answered your question.
Follow up for this question. Like, so because you mentioned asking questions to men and women, I was wondering if like asking about experiences would then kind of get you half side of the story, but then asking about their attitudes would get like from both men and women.
Right. So that is the other thing, is that we wanted indicators that we could collect from both women and men, because we needed scores for both. So if it was actual experiences of domestic violence, all the men will be empowered or adequate in that indicator, and then the women would be the only ones. So that would be one complication. But also, I think it's just kind of more, it's easier to get at information around just attitudes, because it's not necessarily them. You can talk about how it's viewed in your community or that sort of thing. And we are finding kind of different reports, obviously, and it's in line with, I think, what the DHS is finding.
Yeah. I know some of the literature talks about having sole decision-making power around something like child feeding, which is generally a woman's responsibility, is not necessarily as good as having joint decision-making, because if men are engaged, then there's going to be activities of this. Does this help sort out joint decision-making versus sole?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So the question was around sole decision-making around health and nutrition is not necessarily empowering as joint in some contexts. And that is certainly true, and we do find that. So actually in the WEAI, we would count towards adequacy, sole or joint, for this reason, and especially because we're comparing, across different projects, where in one place, like in Bangladesh, joint decision-making is viewed as more empowering, whereas in some of the African contexts, it would be more, in some of the African projects, it would be more sole decision-making. So we would count both towards. So we don't choose one or the other, we kind of count both the same. And both in the original WEAI and in the pro WEAI.
There's one. Okay.
I was wondering, because this is mentioning tracking over time, so most of the modules are, let's say if you're talking about decision making or except time use and others. What I'm thinking is what is your view on how are these actually changing? So can you see a change over time in these metrics? Because that's what the objectives of projects are.
So originally we were thinking, so the question was around what are we seeing in terms of sensitivity of these measures over time. So originally we were thinking, in the original WEAI, we were thinking, oh, these are sticky things, it's not going to change very much. And so we were thinking, well, maybe 2 years would be enough to see change. But actually, so I haven't seen so much of the interim data for Feed the Future, but for Bangladesh, it has changed significantly in that very short period of time. And I think the report is out, I think maybe on the IFPRI as a DP or something. And there's, I think 20% in the empowerment score, which is huge. So even that, I was very surprised to see that much change. We at first thought it was a mistake, so we did all kinds of robustness checking and all that. And it's like, no, it's robust, so it really changed that much. But the thing is that if you're coming for a very low base, so from no decision to some decision, it's an easy hoop to jump. I think if you're, in Feed the Future, Bangladesh actually had the lowest empowerment scores for women compared to the Feed the Future countries. So they were coming from a very low base, so that could be playing into that. But for the ones that have higher empowerment scores, it might be more difficult. And actually, one possibility is to see sort of 2 steps forward, 1 step back, right? Where you're getting, women get empowered and then you see some backlash and they get dispossessed or something like that. We don't know yet. The thing is, the Feed the Future end lines are ongoing. I'm very excited to look at that data. We don't have it yet, unfortunately. The Feed the Future is a 5-year program. So now we're right about the 5-year mark. So we should be getting a better answer to your question soon. But so far, the only data I've seen really is Bangladesh, where they have shown massive change.
I think we're going to need to end.
Okay.
This is another class. Thank you so much. And please, if you have questions, come to the side. Yeah, exactly. Thank you.